It's an old trick I have of taking things that other people take as given and trying to explain.
He is considered one of the greatest economists of our time.
Watch out for those theories, because you have to look at the way the world operates.
His contributions in economic theory reach beyond speculation to far-reaching changes in public policy.
Certainly his ideas will be on the table for the chairman of the SEC.
Because he's always thinking about how the market would solve any problem.
This has become known as the Demsetz critique.
His work affects the way we live in America and the world today.
The government doesn't know what tax to levy and how to calculate these things at all.
Your ideas on property rights have led to a policy change, really a major policy change, and the environmentalists support it.
How did the San Fernando Valley get congested? The government built a freeway and didn't charge anybody to use it. It's that simple.
He's one of the most important figures, certainly in my area of economics, of the last generation.
It would be a great injustice if Harold does not get a Nobel Prize someday. I mean, his contributions have been that important.
All my ideas are very simple.
I pointed that out.
Yeah.
I did not.
You don't have to keep pointing that out. But thinking of it was complex.
Harold Demsetz was born in 1930, Chicago's West Side, in a working-class neighborhood of Italian and Jewish immigrant families, people struggling to find their way up the economic ladder, where despite America's Great Depression, many did. It was the same economic freedom a young Harold Demsetz was seeking too, working in an ice cream factory, for the Northwestern Railway, as a cab driver, electrical apprentice, and usher at the Chicago Civic Opera. He studied engineering, even forestry, and served as a paratrooper at the end of the Korean War before finding a career in economics. Today, he is recognized internationally for his contributions to the understanding of the free market, the relationship between law and economics, and the crucial role property rights play in commerce. The author of 5 books and more than 60 articles, he has been cited in over 5,000 publications. During a distinguished career at the University of Chicago and at UCLA, he has become a legendary figure in the field of economics. In his work, Demsetz is always going farther upstream of the problem, as he puts it, to discover the origins of economic behavior. Taking things as a given is not his style. Interviewed on the campus of UCLA by Mark Grady, professor of law and director of the Center for Law and Economics at UCLA, as a part of the Liberty Fund's Intellectual Portrait Series. This is A Conversation with Harold Demsetz. We begin as he reflects on his first encounter with the study of economics.
When I was at the University of Illinois at Navy Pier in Chicago, you had to take some distribution courses in engineering. And I took a course in economics, and it was taught by a young man who was working on his PhD at the University of Chicago. I got awakened to the problem that has occupied me during most of my professional life in that class. He talked about how is it that an economy in which there's no central planning, no overhead direction, that somehow you get a sensible allocation of resources just for everybody making their own decisions. I never thought about that problem, but it was an intriguing problem, and his teaching began to explain how economists viewed its solution. And I've sort of stuck with that problem most of my life, going in one direction or another around it and into it and so on.
That's the central problem of economics.
After earning his bachelor's degree, Demsetz served as a paratrooper near the end of the Korean War, then used the GI Bill to study for his MBA at Northwestern.
After I got my MBA, I went out and got interviewed by people, businessmen came to interview. I was a complete flop at that. Because the first interviewer said, now, suppose you've been working for us for years and somebody makes you a good offer from another firm. What would you think about that? I said, well, if it was good enough, I'd go. That was the end of the interview. So I went back to Northwestern to the PhD program in economics and got my PhD there.
Demsetz began his teaching career at the University of Michigan, but soon a prestigious opportunity came knocking.
I got an offer from University of California at Los Angeles. It was for about $400 more than I was making then.
What year? That would have been about 1960 or?
I was at Michigan in 1958 through 60.
So that was real money in those days.
Well, it was $400 on top of a $6,000 salary, so it wasn't peanuts. They wanted to keep me there at Michigan, and they brought me in to the dean of liberal arts, and he talked to me, and he said quite correctly that $400 is not important to your career. And Michigan had a very good economics department at that time. And I thought about that, and I said, well, if it's not very important, why don't you pay me the $400? And then I found out he meant it wasn't important to me. At the University of Michigan, it was important. So Rita and our newborn child drove off into the sunset to California at UCLA.
At UCLA, Demsetz met Armin Alchian, founder of the UCLA tradition in economics. Alchian and Demsetz would later be co-authors.
Armin, of course, was the great.
He was the intellectual leader at UCLA, right, and a great man in the profession, absolutely. And he had co-authored a paper with Reuben Kessel, who was then at the University of Chicago Business School. A very good paper, an interesting paper. And Reuben asked him if we had anybody good young at UCLA. So Armin, who's a believer in competition, as I am, mentioned me. So I met Reuben Kessel at the American Economics Association meeting, and he asked me, "Are you unhappy at UCLA?"
And what'd you say?
Well, I didn't know Reuben at that time, but I gave him exactly the answer that he would appeal to him. I said, "Make me unhappy." And they did. And they did. So I went to Chicago.
He was clearly a rising star, very much sought after commodity on the academic market. I was thrilled when he decided to move here.
George Shultz was the dean at that time.
The later Secretary of State, I think, right?
Yes, he became Secretary of State. First he was Secretary of Labor, and then he became Secretary of State. George Stigler had the Walgreen chair at that time. Reuben Kessel was on the faculty. There were other good people on the faculty, Lester Telser, Pashigian, and the economics department, of course, had terrific members of the department, Harry Johnson, as well as Milton Friedman and others. And while I was there, Gary Becker came back, and Posner came to the law school at that time. Aaron, director in the law school, was there. Ronald Coase came either a year before or a year after me. I don't remember which way it goes.
Another great colleague
of
yours.
Well, but George Stigler, I got to talk about.
You want to talk about him? Okay.
Yeah, he and Ronald Coase, but I think maybe George Stigler more than Ronald Coase, was the most influential fellow academic in my life. Okay. He was a dominating personality, and he had an amazing ability to get to the heart of a problem in economics, okay? And he is the one that got hung up on this quantification business. That now that we know how to measure things and how to use statistical tools and things like this, we can do all the evidence gathering, and the politicians won't be able to come to a different conclusion than the one we wanted them to. Of course, he was wrong about that. As his own work later would show, that the politicians do what people are willing to pay them to do, not what the evidence shows, okay? We used to commute in together, sharing the ride from the south suburbs of Chicago. One time we came in, and we didn't go to where we usually park. He was driving. I said, "Where are we going?" He says, "To the dean's house, George Shultz." I said, "What are we going to do there?" He said, "You see the saws in the back seat there?" I said, "Turn around." I said, "Yeah, there's saws in the back seat." He said, "What are we going to do with the saws?" He says, "George is putting in some new carpets and he needs some doors shortened so that they won't rub against the carpet." So we shortened a few doors for him. That kind of thing I could do. I was an apprentice electrician at one time. I was, one part of me is a blue-collar worker, okay? So we shortened the doors. I don't know why, but about 3 weeks after that, I got promoted to full professor.
Stigler was also the leader of the Industrial Organization Workshop and founder of it.
Stigler, Industrial Organization, which is one of the fields I specialize in, used to be a field that was populated by economists who were a lot like lawyers. Mm-hmm. I mean, they wrote about monopoly and competition in a verbal style, which I don't object to, verbal style, but they hardly ever made testable propositions, and they never tested the propositions, okay? Right. And George got this idea that he was going to make industrial organization into a scientific subject, and he did. He created, of course, he couldn't do that alone, but he was the main creator of industrial organization as we now know it. And he did it by concocting very interesting explanations of phenomena, going out, getting the data, seeing whether these explanations held up to the test of the data, and so on. And he ran this workshop, which had a reputation across the country for being a tough workshop.
How does a Chicago workshop work?
Well, an invited guest, which could be a fellow faculty member, gives a paper he's working on, okay? And he stands up and tries to present it. Okay. Okay. And,
why do you say try?
Well,
I mean, don't they listen politely to what the professor has?
At Chicago, unlike most places, most of the people who are in the audience, who are the fellow economists, have read the paper. Mm-hmm. They don't really need the presentation. That's not true in most places. Most places, the faculty doesn't really read the paper. They sit and have it explained to them, so they have to listen to the paper then. Well, that wasn't true in Chicago. Well, in the audience, they had Aaron Director, mm-hmm. George Stigler, Ronald Coates, myself.
You, right?
Later on, Posner, Becker, right. Okay, and a few other very good people.
These are the leading minds of the Chicago School of Economics.
So it was a tough workshop.
Are these economists bashful at this workshop about expressing their opinions?
Not the ones in the audience.
I remember seeing him in workshops where he's very, very, I guess a euphemistic way of describing it is rigorous. He's a tough cookie.
Now, Chicago, the University of Chicago at that point was in a great competition with Harvard, I think.
Not as the University of Chicago was, but a lot of that competition in economics was between Milton Friedman and the Keynesian people who populated most of the rest of the university. So it was a contest between the monetarists and the fiscal policy people. George Stigler was in favor of antitrust laws at that time. Okay, most people were in favor of antitrust laws at Chicago. So one couldn't say at that time that Chicago was opposed to antitrust laws, but the East Coast was in favor of antitrust laws.
Why did the Chicago people think the antitrust laws were important?
George Stigler thought that they were important because the antitrust laws said, in effect, we want competitive markets, okay? Which means, in George Stigler's deeper thoughts, we really don't want socialism. Uh-huh. So let's take care of the monopoly and commit the country through the antitrust laws to having a market economy that we're going to try to make competitive. Of course, the people at Chicago mm-hmm. did like markets better right. than government, right. more than people at most places.
Right.
George Stigler changed his mind later as a result of work that was done, because the work that was done that made people begin to think that the way the antitrust laws were being enforced was bad for the economy was done first here mm-hmm. by yours truly, mm-hmm. okay, after I had left Chicago.
And what is that idea? What is your idea in that article?
Well, the idea actually comes from Chicago, uh-huh. so we got to give them some credit, okay? It was at a nice discussion at the Quadrangle Club in Chicago. And we were discussing it, and somebody mentioned that, in the automobile industry, the only company that's really making money is GM. Mm-hmm. Okay? When I came back here, I didn't find students doing the dissertations that I thought they should do, which involved applied testing of theory in my mind. It's a great thing for students to do. They look at the theory, maybe they jiggle it, they go out and they test it. So I said, well, I'm going to try to get them to do this in two ways, by teaching, okay, and by doing the research myself to show them. So I started this research project, which was only to find out whether what that observation at the University of Chicago Roundtable was true generally. Okay, so I got data on a lot of industries. Okay, market concentration data on firm size, etc. And I looked at these data, and lo and behold, the only companies that steadily were making high profits were not all those that were in highly concentrated industries, but only those who were in concentrated industries which were large firms. Okay, which is evidence of some kind of scale economies. Okay, so if you look at medium-sized firms across all these industries, okay, some of these industries are highly concentrated, some are not concentrated at all. You could do a correlation between concentration and profit rate for these medium-sized firms. If the monopoly explanation were correct, there ought to be a positive correlation. The medium-sized firms get the benefit of the colluded price, as well as the big firms do. So when the industry is concentrated, they ought to get high profits. When the industry is not concentrated, you ought to only get a competitive rate of return. But if you look at the medium-sized firms, there's no correlation at all. It's only when you look at the largest firms that you find this kind of correlation pop up. I don't like to start at the same point that the other people like to start. So the question in the back of my mind is, why did the industries become concentrated? That was never a starting point for most of this discussion in IO. Well, after I looked at these data, I began to think about it, okay, which gave birth to the first article that revealed these results, which was, I think, the lead article, I think, in the Journal of Law and Economics at one time. I said, well, suppose that a firm makes a breakthrough on how to produce something cheaper, okay, or how to produce more cheaply at a larger scale, or how to produce a better product for people, okay. That firm begins to grow. It takes market share away from the other firms. And it goes on doing this until the industry becomes, if it's very successful, becomes concentrated, okay? So the industry becomes concentrated, not because the firm wanted to be a monopoly and raise prices.
Right.
If that's all you needed, every industry would be concentrated. Everybody would say, let's get concentrated, okay, and raise prices. It got concentrated because this firm was doing better than the other firms did, okay? And so if you look at the other firms in the industries, the medium-sized firms, the ones that didn't do so good, they didn't get the high profit rates. If you break apart that large firm, which is what the antitrust authorities wanted to do, you give up the advantages of what that firm accomplished. Right. After that was published, some business firms, I don't want to mention who they were, well, they liked that research, okay? Obviously, they weren't in concentrated industries. So they came by my office and they said they'd like to support my research, things like that. I said, well, I can get my research money elsewhere. I said, if you really want to do something, why don't you sponsor a conference at which we'll argue this thing out? And they did. They sponsored what became the Airlie House Conference, which took place in Virginia somewhere around 1972.
74, I think.
74.
It's a famous conference.
Right. And it was a terrific conference because in attendance were some of the leading economists in industrial organizations, some of the leading people in antitrust law, some leading business people, and a lot of good papers presented, and a lot of give and take, and it came out published in a book in which the paper I presented some additional data on the same thing is located. And it was a successful conference. I think that conference is what really changed the direction of antitrust prosecution for a time anyway. I did it in two ways. First, it cast suspicion on the market concentration doctrine, made the antitrust authorities less prone to simply break companies up, although they still do it. And two, it made vertical integration seem a lot more innocent than the antitrust authorities at that time thought it was. So that was an instance in which economic work combined with a conference in which relevant policy people were invited did have an impact.
His writings have influenced antitrust policy, which changed dramatically during the Reagan administration.
One thing that goes through Harold's work is he's always thinking about how the market would solve any problem. And it doesn't matter what the problem is, his first instinct is, well, why can't private transactors contract over that, or why can't private transactors figure out a way? Why do you need government in there to solve this kind of problem?
Here's an idea that I've always thought came from one of your articles, the one about property rights. The old system that we had in Los Angeles for regulating air pollutants, and to some extent we've still got this system, was command and control regulation. So the government would actually establish for every pollutant how much every factory could emit into the environment. It was kind of like the Soviet Union on some level, and so they had to solve all of these issues about who could abate more and who ought to abate less.
So George Stigler would say that the industries would solve them for him, but it's true that having this regulating in detail like this is something that's poor policy generally.
But now I think one very
I
idea.
wrote something about it, and I don't know whether I was first or 10th in writing about it. But the idea is a good idea, and it's a simple idea. And that says, well, if the market can't easily handle a problem like air pollution, why can't it easily handle a problem? Well, it's difficult to have somebody own the quality of the air. Mm-hmm. There's a big free rider problem. If I drive a car and I say, I'm going to put a smog device on my controlling device on my car at my cost, and everybody benefits freely from that because they get to breathe the cleaner air. Well, hardly anybody's going to want to put a device on their car. They want to wait for other people to do it. So it's a difficult problem for the market to wrestle to the ground. But you could have the authorities, presumably with high-quality research behind them, which is not necessarily true, say what the total amount of air pollutants are we want to allow into the air, and then you could specify, number of tons of air pollutants, and you could issue coupons or certificates that give permission to put a ton of pollutant in the air. And you could distribute these to industry with the total number of coupons equaling in sum the total amount of pollution you want to put into the air. And then you let these guys buy and sell these coupons back and forth. The nice thing about that is that a firm that finds it very costly to get rid of pollution, and that means costly for customers of his product also, would buy the coupons from a firm that finds it very easy to get rid of pollution, right. And you'd get the total desired amount of pollution obtained at the lowest possible cost. Whereas if you go around in detailed regulation of you could put this out, you could put that out, you get a mess, Right. So it was a good idea, and it shows what private property rights can do. So the coupons become private property rights.
It's a successful idea. They use that. They use that idea. The EPA uses that idea.
That's
that would be an example of how your ideas on property rights have led to a policy change, really a major policy change. And the environmentalists support it. Before you wrote this piece, I don't think people understood clearly how property rights solve social problems. And what that article led to was really a more aggressive use of property rights in order to solve some very thorny problems that couldn't be solved with the traditional regulation.
I'm very glad I wrote the article.
How about if we talk about another set of ideas? And these ideas, I think, have been influential too. And I'm thinking about your ideas about the nature of the firm. What does a firm mean in your mind?
If we go back to neoclassical theory, where I often dwell, they had an implicit explanation for the existence of the firm. What you see in neoclassical theory is firms selling to households, and households selling their labor resources and other resources to firms, and firms buying them from households. You got this circular flow of goods going to households, resources going from households to goods. So what the firm is in neoclassical theory is a specialized producer of goods. Mm-hmm. It doesn't produce goods for itself. Mm-hmm. It produces goods for sale to households. Mm-hmm. So what is the rationale for the existence of the firm? The productivity of specialization.
What does that mean in economic terms?
It means that if you do the same thing
right.
over and over again,
right.
like produce the same product over and over again, like Ford Sr. produced that same Model T Ford
right.
over and over again, you could produce it at a lower cost.
So your theory...
Now that's too narrow. You know, if you could produce steel products, you specialize right. in producing steel products, but you don't also produce corn.
Right.
Okay, because you're not very productive if you try to do things that are not associated with each other. Right. So the neoclassical theories, and I believe that this is the correct theory of the existence of firms, is that productivity, specialization is productive. And that's why firms exist.
So it's a very simple idea. It's all about specialization.
All my ideas are very simple.
I pointed that out.
Yeah.
Now, does that,
you don't have to keep pointing that out.
Does that make them falsifiable? Is that a virtue?
It helps.
Is that a virtue to have?
Well, I think simpler ideas are easier to test. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So there's no bias against simple ideas in economics.
Well, not in this economist. Okay.
Although your theory is simple, I think it's also testable. In other words, it's leading to different implications from.
Right. Exactly. If the cost of marketing falls, mm-hmm. okay, then you ought to find consumers buying more goods, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that firms as a group are more important in the economy than what? What's the opposite of firms in my theory? The opposite of firms in my theory is a self-sufficient household. Right. Because if the transaction cost is very high, so the firm can't sell to customers, the customer has to produce for himself. Right. So the opposite of a firm is a self-sufficient household. And as transactions costs go down, like when shipping costs go down, mm-hmm. I'm predicting you'll find less self-sufficiency, in this case in nations right. being less self-sufficient and buying more from another nation, okay? And that means that firms, because there are more specialized producers throughout the world as a result of shipping costs going down, firms are producing a larger fraction of GMP relative to self-sufficient households than they would if transaction costs were high.
As was the case at Chicago, intellectual engagement with colleagues at UCLA influenced Demsetz, setting the stage for his own path-breaking research.
When I came here, there were a bunch of really excellent people at UCLA. In 1971, Armin Alchian was here and active. Now he's retired. And I had Axel Jonefit, who was a world's leading scholar on macroeconomics and Keynes, what Keynes said and what he didn't say. And Sam Peltzman, who was in my field and very good, a product of the University of Chicago. Jack Hirschleifer, a fine economist who had an interdisciplinary interest in biology and economics. Bob Clower, who was the only man I know who could get up in front of class without any preparation and talk, and the students would listen and listen and listen. The main thing that I really gained professionally, aside from some good colleagues here, because I left good colleagues at Chicago too, was I had steady access to our PhD students and was able to chair something like 42 or 43 dissertations while I was here.
You've had a tremendous influence, I think, through your PhD students. I think some of them are teaching at Harvard. They're teaching at some of the best economics departments in the country, I think.
It's been very gratifying. Some of the most gratifying students I've had have been foreign students in the last 10 years from Korea and China. Who are now back home populating the universities there. And as a matter of fact, I have an invitation to partake in a conference in Beijing this October.
The Chinese government asked you to speak in China, I think.
Yes. The year of the Tiananmen Square, I got an invitation to go over and speak from, I can't remember the exact name, but it was essentially the state agency in control of business or something like that. And the trip got called off because of the Tiananmen Square riots. They said the students are all out in the street, nobody will be around to hear you. But I went the year after. And the group that listened to me were some students, some professors, some bureaucrats. And they asked me to lecture on private property. Well, it was always a puzzle to me why they wanted me over there to talk on this topic. That was not a time yet when things were being transformed in China. And I found out a good way through these lectures what was going on. This bureau that brought me over there wanted to have stock created in the state-owned companies. And this bureau would control 51% of the stock. So they wanted me to.
Now,
they wanted me to talk about how good it is to have stock ownership of a corporation.
Now, does that support your theory of property, or is that evidence against it?
No, it supports Stigler's theory of how politics works.
Now, do you think that the system of private property is related to liberty?
I don't think you can have liberty without private property. Liberty means essentially the power to do something. To do something, you have to have control over resources, over assets. Okay, so the private property goes together with liberty. I don't think you can. You see, there's all kinds of liberty. If you talk about liberty in the sense of the right to vote, you could have that without having private property.
Do you think, as some people do, that China's decision to create private property will ultimately put them on a road that leads them to political liberty?
Well, it's not clear which way they're going to go. Okay, right now they're going in that way. Okay, I think that what many people don't realize is that when you create capitalism, essentially private property and business firms, you create an avenue for people to accumulate wealth, which they do, okay? When they've got that wealth, they become effective competitors for the state. Whereas in a truly socialist or communist society where everybody works for the state, there ain't no way that you could really mount resistance except through revolution. So capitalism does create a means of restricting the scope of governmental activity, both by providing an alternative way to handle problems, such as the pollution problem we talked about, and by way of being able to mount political competition to those who are in power, which they couldn't do if you didn't have accumulations of private capital. So there's a close nexus between the two. Now, so I think China is going to be under pressure like this. There are a lot of wealthy people being created in China. A lot of them can't be too happy with all the things that the government's going to be doing. So there's going to be pressure to create competition for the people that are in power. And the people in power are going to resist that. You know, up to now, they've been able to hold on to dictatorial power, political power in the regime, and let the private economy go. But the private economy has been going for only 20 years or something like that. That's a short time in the history of the world. And sooner or later, there's going to be a juncture reach, at which either democracy comes to China or they kill the private enterprise economy, in my opinion.
Let's talk about your work with federal judges. Could you tell us a little bit about that work? Because I think it was very important.
Well, the entrepreneur for that was Henry Manny. And it started sometime in the 1960s. I can't remember exactly when Henry was at Rochester University. He somehow got the funding for a modest program in which we started out teaching law professors economics. Armin Elchin and I were the two main lecturers in that program.
Well, it's had tremendous influence. I mean, your students from that era, because I've seen the photographs, I mean, they included really the leading legal academics in the country. I mean, people who've taught at Yale, who've taught at Harvard, who've really taught at our best law schools, they've all been, or a good fraction of them have been your students in that course.
It's a healthy, good marriage between law and economics. That's not true of all disciplines. Mm-hmm. It's true both for economics and for law.
Who was A.C. Pigou?
A.C. Pigou was a famous British economist who inherited the chair of the more famous economist at that time, Alfred Marshall, at Cambridge, I believe. And he pointed out something that economics was ignoring. He wasn't the first one, by the way. Alfred Marshall pointed it out, actually, in his textbook, but he did it in an entirely different context, an entirely different way, and it didn't make many waves. Pigou picked up the idea, and he wrote a book called The Economics of Welfare, in which this was the centerpiece, this idea. And the idea is what came to be known as externalities in the profession. And what that said, what it was about was the following. Well, in the marketplace, if you want something, you pay for it. And if you want to supply it, you pay the cost of supplying it. And if you can't find somebody who wants to buy it, well, you go out of business. You get what you pay for. And whoever buys what they purchase from me gets what they purchase from me. Whoever doesn't buy it from me doesn't get it, okay? Well, Pigou said, just a minute. Because you run this, he didn't use this example, you run this steel plant, this steel mill,
right,
and you produce coal, and you use coal, and you produce steel, and you sell the steel to people. They get the steel, just like the market says, they pay for it. They don't get it unless they're willing to pay enough to cover the cost of producing it. So that's the way resources get allocated nice and efficiently. They only go where people are willing to pay to have them, okay? But when you burn that coal, soot comes out of the smokestack. Mm-hmm. And that soot descends on, let's say, a neighboring laundry.
Okay.
Okay. And it makes it more expensive to launder the clothes.
Right.
Okay. Well, this launderer didn't buy that soot. He doesn't want it. Okay.
That's an externality.
That's an externality. It's something that's an external cost. There could be external benefits. External benefit is I put a nice garden in my front yard, and all the neighbors enjoy it as they walk by, and they didn't pay for it, okay? So it breaks the nexus between getting what you pay for and getting. Sometimes you get a bad externality, sometimes you get a good externality. So he pointed this out, and he said, because of this, you're not really getting the efficient allocation of resources that the exponents of neoclassical economics claimed came from the market, because there was no market transaction here.
So you're getting too many bad externalities like soot, and too few.
Well, it's not just the soot, but that's true. What you said is true.
Okay.
What it really is, you raise the cost of laundering, so the price of laundry goes up. You give less clean clothes than you otherwise would get.
Right.
And since the steel mill owner doesn't pay the launderer for the damages,
right,
he produces more steel than he would if he had to pay the damages. So you get too much steel and too little cleansing of clothes, right, as a result of these externalities, as compared to what you would get if everybody paid for everything they got and didn't get anything they didn't pay for.
Right. Now, what was his solution to that problem? Because he had some solutions, I think.
Well,
right?
His solution was, I call it a nirvana solution, okay? Somehow the government knows exactly how much the steel mill ought to pay for putting out that soot. And it levies a tax on the steel mill in proportion to the amount of soot that's put out, or the amount of soft coal that it uses, okay? And that tax raises the cost of the steel mill of using the soft coal, so it'll use less soft coal, you'll get less steel, and if the government sets the tax at exactly the right place, you'll get the efficient amount of steel out of there. And the efficient amount of cleanse clothes.
And why would that be? Why would that be a nirvana for the government?
Well, the government doesn't know what tax to levy and how to calculate these things at all.
But taxation was his solution, and you had to get the taxes exactly right in order to get efficiency.
Yeah, you could overshoot and have too little coal and too little steel.
Right,
okay?
and make the problem worse, possibly.
Possibly, okay.
Okay, now
so that was Pagoo's claim to fame. Okay,
right.
He created this problem, and over the years he convinced almost the entire economics profession of the validity of his criticism.
Right.
Okay.
Now that's where your friend and colleague at Chicago.
Yeah, I'm coming to that.
Okay.
He didn't convince one person, at least one person, and that was Ronald Coase.
Okay.
Ronald Coase thought that Pagoo was ignoring an important consideration, and that is he was ignoring the fact that it costs something to use the price system, costs something to transact in the marketplace, and therefore his reasoning went askance. Well, yes and no, okay. Coase conjured up two cases. One in which there's no cost of transacting. You can carry on any transactions you want without having to pay somebody to be your agent or whatever the case may be, okay. In that case, there is no externality. Why? Because let's suppose the law says that the steel mill has the right to burn soft coal without paying a tax.
Right.
Okay. In that case, the soot comes out, descends on the laundry. Now look at this whole thing prospectively. This hasn't happened yet. Steel mill's about to open up business. The launderer says, "Oh, wait a minute. You're going to make my business worse because you're imposing a cost on me." Steel mill says, "Well, I'm sorry, but I have the right to do this," okay? So in that case, the guy who owns the laundry goes over and knocks at the CEO's door of the steel mill and says, "I'll pay you to use less soft coal or produce less steel." And how much will he pay? He'll pay an amount that's up to the additional cost that's imposed upon him by the soot, if he didn't eliminate that soot.
The damage to his laundry.
The damage to his laundry, right? Okay. Well, in this way, the owner of the steel mill does take into account the damage done to the laundry, because if he continues to produce the same amount of steel, he foregoes receiving this payment from the launderer. Okay? So this cost is not external.
There's no externality.
There's no externality. The cost is no longer external to the steel mill owner's calculations.
Now that depends upon the laundry owner being able actually to go over and to make this.
That's the zero transaction cost.
That's the zero transaction cost case.
So let's suppose that it costs $100 to install a smoke precipitator, which takes the soot out of the smokestack. Okay?
Right.
So the launderer comes over. If he's willing to pay $100 or more, the soot gets taken out of the air.
Right.
Okay. If he's not willing to pay that much, the precipitator does not get installed, and the soot still comes out of the smokestack. Okay. So you have these alternatives depending on what the arithmetic is in the case. Let's suppose now that he doesn't want to pay $100. So the soot comes out of the air. Now a law student says, a law professor jumps up in class and says, "Oh, well, the law should have said that the owner of the laundry has a right to soot-free air." Okay, so now the steel mill can't put that soot out without breaking the law. Right. These are all law-abiding citizens, all right? Yes. If he does put the soot out, he'll have to pay damages. Okay. So now the CEO who owns the steel mill goes over to the laundry. He says, "Gee, my costs are higher as a result of this law. I'll pay you for your permission to put soot up in the air." Okay. And the launderer says, "Well, how much are you willing to pay?" Okay. And the steel mill says, "I'll pay you more than $100, or $100 anyway. $100 I'll pay you." And the launderer stops and says, "Well, the cost that's imposing on me as we reckoned in the last example,
Yes.
is less than $100.
Right.
So he says, okay, it's a deal. So you get soot in the air no matter which way the law assigns the rate.
And that's the Coase theorem, I think, isn't it?
That's right. That's the Coase theorem. That's what George Stigler called it, the Coase theorem.
Right.
Coase never did.
Right.
Okay. That no matter which way you assign, no matter which way you define the law, you get the efficient amount of soot and the efficient amount of laundering in the air.
See, I think that's why your theory, I think that's why your work was so important in the Chicago tradition, because you can have the Coase theorem, but unless you have property rights, as you demonstrated.
Oh, that's right. You're right about that, and I don't think I've ever really emphasized that. So I think that's a good point, okay? I'll have to write an article on that.
Well,
I'll give you a footnote.
I don't know. I mean, even they're creating property rights, in this new world. I mean, I think to some extent, as I've said, I think it's been created.
Well, I do say something in this new book of essays about property rights being a prerequisite to transactions.
Right.
Okay, so that's true.
How about here in the Los Angeles basin, where they've created these property rights over to I mean, that's really what they are, property rights to emit pollution. I mean, that's really that's coming from your work,
Well,
I think.
they're really property rights to these certificates, which give you the right to put pollution in the air. If you don't have any certificates, you can't put the soot in the air. Okay.
Well, to paraphrase a great judge, what is a certificate but the use thereof?
Okay. I'll accept that.
The topic returned to Demsetz's work on transaction costs, the theory of the firm, insider trading, and competition in public utilities.
Transaction costs have been important in your work too. You did some important empirical research on transaction
everybody
costs.
Everybody talked about transaction costs, and nobody studied them. So I decided I would study them. So I said, first of all, how can I measure transaction costs? And I thought about it, and finally I came across a good way, and that was the only innovative thing in the paper I did on that, really. I said, let's think about the stock exchange. If you think about the stock exchange, in the days when I wrote, there was a specialist on the stock exchange who kept the book on the stock. And you as an outsider would call your broker and send in an offer to that specialist who would put it in his book. Mm-hmm. And other people would send in their offers. So there were two kinds of offers you could have. One is a market offer, in which says you buy at the best price you can instantaneously, okay? Right. And the other is a limit offer. So I'm talking about a limit offer now. So I send in a limit offer to buy a stock at a certain price, okay, and that's called a bid price. Mm-hmm. It goes on the broker's book, on the specialist books as a bid price. And somebody else wants to wants to sell this stock, sends in an ask order, right. And that goes on the book. Well, whenever an ask order crosses a bid order, a transaction takes place. Mm-hmm. So what's left on the book are the highest bid offer and the lowest ask offer that have not transacted. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now stop a minute.
Okay.
Suppose you submit two offers at the same time, two market orders at the same time. A market order to buy the stock and a market order to sell the same stock instantaneously. Mm-hmm. Okay? Then you buy it at the ask price and you sell it at the lower bid price. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's the cost of transacting on the New York Stock Exchange. Okay?
Well, that's a very simple idea.
Yeah, well, it is. That's true, it is. But thinking of it was complex.
Well.
So, and then I did an empirical study to see what determined the size of that spread on different stocks. Mm-hmm. And what turns out to be an important variable is the volume of transactions in the stock. The larger the volume of transactions, the smaller the bid-ask spread.
You've been interested in business with your work on antitrust, industrial organization, but also in your work on the theory of the firm. And one of the things, one of the articles that has been very famous, certainly very influential, is your study. I think it was the first study of its kind, looking at the structure of ownership in corporations.
Well, there was a literature that goes back to an important book written in 1930, I think, by two people, a lawyer and economist, Burley and Means. That book said that, I paraphrased the book, it said, look, economics is teaching us about what firms do. I would say not very well, by the way, okay? But economics was teaching us about what firms do, and part of that teaching is that The owner controls what happens, and he seeks to maximize profit, okay? And one way he does that is by holding costs down, and that's good for society to hold the costs down. Right. And then competition will keep them from raising price too high, and everybody is happy as a result of that. So you get a nice allocation of resources out of it. And they said, but the world we see out there with the modern corporation doesn't look like that firm at all, okay? And their pet phrase was a separation between ownership and control. That there were shareholders who owned the corporation, but they were such a dispersed group that they couldn't exercise much control over the management, and the management was really controlling the corporation. So you had a separation between ownership and control. And this allowed the management to use the shareholder assets, the corporation's assets, in ways that catered to the management rather than to the shareholders.
Right. That's still kind of a familiar theme, I think. Yeah.
It's an important theme still.
But that's where the idea came from.
That's where the idea came from.
Right.
Then George Stigler organized a conference in honor of, I think it was the 50th year of publication of The Modern Corporation and Private Property, the book that Burley Amines wrote. Okay, and that was held at Hoover. And I had to write a paper for that. I was invited to the conference. I wrote a paper for it. And that paper essentially argued that when people form a corporation, they can have the bylaws do pretty much what they want in that corporation, okay? And they can have all the capital provided by only a few people, so it would be tightly owned, and then the management would not be able to get away with murder on it. They could have these shareholders on the board of directors if they're tightly owned. You could design the corporation any way you want. So I said, well, there must be a reason that the corporations that Burley Amines are talking about, these diffusely owned corporations, are designed the way they are.
Yes.
Okay. And there's obvious what the explanation is. To design a corporation that's tightly controlled, a few people have to put up a hell of a lot of money. That makes them subject to risk. And the risk is very specific to that firm.
Right.
So they can't...
Because they have all of their eggs in one basket.
Many of their eggs in one basket there, okay? So now, suppose you start out with a small firm like that, which is the way they usually start out. The firm is a success, it grows, okay? And they need more capital, okay? So they say, okay, you guys put up the capital some more. And they say, well, no, wait a minute, we got enough capital in here. Now, why not sell some stock to other people, okay? And everybody realizes that this is making the control function of the shareholders weaker. Right. But they say it's worth it in order for us to not bear more firm-specific risks and to allow us to diversify the portfolio. Right. And despite the fact that management will get away with some things in doing it, on average, overall, this is better for us as shareholders, okay, than what otherwise would be. So that was the idea that I had in this paper. It's an old trick I have of taking things that other people take as given and trying to explain. Right. So Burley Amines took the modern corporation in the form they interpreted it as a given. And I said, well, let's explain why it comes about. Anyway, when I was talking about becoming dean at the business school at WashU. So I went there to visit for a year. And I met a young man who just got his PhD.
This is Ken Lane, I think.
Ken Lane, who's now at the business school at the University of Pittsburgh. He's a full-blown co-author of this paper. So I said, okay, here's a project we can work on. So we worked on this project and we turned out a paper that became a pretty good, a big success. And what this paper said, we're going to try to explain what causes ownership structure in some corporations to be tighter than it is in other corporations. Okay?
Because there's a variance? I mean,
there is a variance. Even in the top 500 corporations, there's a considerable variance in the ownership structure. Some companies, probably some of them coming from family interests, own, like Ford Motor Company owns something like 60%. The family owns 60% of the voting stock.
They're taking a lot of risk when they do that.
Yeah, that's right, but some do it. I mean, we don't deny that there are risk takers in this world. Okay, I don't deny that. So we set about this project, and we got the data. and we examined the top 500 corporations, and we were able to explain a considerable part of the variation in the ownership structure of these corporations from these data. And some of the findings were pretty obvious, and some of them were not so obvious. The obvious finding was the larger the firm, the more diffuse would be the ownership structure, because larger firms need more capital.
Right. To
get more capital from a few people means more eggs in one basket.
Yes.
So you would expect that to be the case, and it is the case. And we also found that the higher is the firm's specific risk, you could get a change in ownership structure in response to firm-specific risk. If it's a regulated industry, it was more diffusely owned than any other kind of industry for the same size firm. When Ken Lane and I wrote that paper, we reasoned as follows, that what firm-specific risk means is that the affairs of the company bounce up and down a lot, irrespective of the market. Mm-hmm. Okay, sometimes the affairs of a company bounce up and down because there's a good business conditions or a depression, and so the rest of the companies in the economy. But there's a component of the variation in the stock price or in the profit rate of the firm that is associated mainly only with its own doings and not with the market or the economy. So, and that's what we call firm-specific risk. Mm-hmm. Some firms have higher firm-specific risk than other firms do, okay? And we said, well, a firm that has high specific risk is one in which things are bouncing up and down a lot, so the management always has to be on its toes to take care of things, to make sure that the market doesn't clobber them by its bouncing up and down. And therefore, you need tighter control of management to make sure that they tend to their task, and you'll get a more concentrated ownership structure, right, which you do get. Right. Okay. The other side of the coin on that, which made me later worry about it, was tight ownership, high firm-specific risk. That means that the shareholders are bearing even more risk, right, than they otherwise would. So why would they want to put all their eggs in one basket?
These are the real gamblers.
Yeah, right. Okay, and there are some people like that, okay. So that made me worry about it. And I thought about it, and I came up with a very interesting alternative explanation for the sign, SIGN, of that coefficient on firm-specific risk. I take seriously the last point I made. That why should somebody put a lot of their eggs in one basket when they get the same dividends per share that a minority shareholder gets, okay? If they sell their share at the same time that a minority shareholder sells his share, they get the same price. Right. Okay, all the rewards of the company are the same for them as it is for the minority shareholder. Right. So they would prefer to be minority shareholders. Why should they bear this firm-specific risk, right, of having all their eggs in that one basket? Right. And I said, therefore, there has to be some special compensation for them. Right. Okay. And what is that? I said, insider information. Uh-huh. The large shareholders, the blockholders, have access to knowledge about what's going on in the firm that the minority shareholders don't have. Mm-hmm. And they can make more money than the minority shareholders by timing their trading, their buying and selling. So they do get a special payment in the form of insider trading. But this is a social function performed by insider trading because it makes the firm more tightly controlled than it otherwise would be.
I think they can get into legal trouble that way too, can't they? If they do too much of that?
Do what?
Too much insider trading?
Oh, if they get caught. Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I'm not saying that it's legal.
Right. You're saying it happens.
I'm also saying it still gets done, even if it's not legal. Right. But I'm saying maybe it should be legal. Right. Because it serves a socially useful function.
It should be legal because
in the process of doing this, I gathered data and tested it out that it conforms with the predictions that this theory would say. So I really like that little paper.
You know, I've had a fun career to this point. I've done a lot of different things, but I think clearly the biggest thrill I've had in my career has been working with Harold on that paper.
Comes along Harold in the 1970s and says, wait a minute.
Harold asked a very simple but penetrating question. How did the monopolists become the monopolist?
What happens is somebody finds a way to lower costs, makes profits. Because of his profits, he grows in his market share, And he may take over the whole market because he's got a competitive advantage over somebody else. Either it's evidence of monopoly power, it could be evidence of superior efficiency.
There's been a huge effect in terms of policy where we no longer equate bigness with badness and monopoly.
Here's an idea that you've developed. People used to say, if you have something like a utility, that's by its very nature, say it's an electric utility, by its very nature, the more subscribers you've got, the lower the average cost is going to be. And if that's true, then they said you couldn't have competition. Competition would not work in that situation because the optimum firm size would be
one firm industry.
One firm industry. It'd be a natural monopoly. And so that's why we have to have monopolies in these utilities. Now, you had a famous article that was critical of that position.
My argument went in the following way. It's one thing to say you end up with a one-firm industry, which you will if there are economies of scale of significance, okay?
That means if the costs are constantly falling.
Larger rate of output, lower unit cost,
right?
Okay? You'll end up with a one-firm industry, okay? But that does not immediately translate to a monopoly price. And the reason it doesn't immediately translate to a monopoly price is because when this whole thing starts, you don't know who that one firm is going to be. So there's a competition to become the one firm. So the community says, we want a computer network set up for our city that all our citizens can use, okay? And it gets competitors to submit bids on it. If there are significant economies of scale, one of these competitors is going to win, the one who does the best job as far as the community is concerned, or the one who takes care of the politicians best, okay?
Either one.
Yeah, okay, I don't want Stiegler to turn over. Okay. And that competition will end up with an agreement between the community and whoever wins that contract, which keeps the price down below a monopoly level. The trouble with theorists and with nirvanists is they think you can create a perfect world. Well, you can't. You can't take care of all problems perfectly. So you're going to end up sometimes with the utility making more than you thought they deserved. Sometimes they'll make less than you thought they deserved. But you can make it do pretty well if you're careful about how you do these things.
Because again, regulation has got its own problems.
Right on.
Now, Harold, the original thinker that he is, comes up with the idea, why don't we use the force of competition to get rid of all the regulation?
He has a very important article on why regulate utilities.
One of the remarkable things, now you've got, I learned, 5,000 citations, I think over 5,000 citations to your work.
Well, there are all kinds of possible explanations for that.
Yes.
One is I'm a good economist. Two, a lot of the citations are criticizing me.
That's good, though, too.
Three, I wrote a lot of articles in which I cited myself. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what fraction it counts for. Well, I'm happy to hear that. If I were still on the regular faculty, I'd go ask for a raise after this session.
Harold wrote a classic article called Towards the Theory of Property Rights, which was the first piece that explored why we see different systems of property rights, which was a powerful piece.
His initial work was on the economics of property rights, and he was doing really groundbreaking work at the same time that Ronald Coase was doing his work on it.
I ran into one of my students the other day, one of my law students, and I said, well, tomorrow I was going to be talking on camera with my old teacher. She said, we know Harold Demsetz. We read his Toward a Theory of Property Rights in Property. So I think it's very common for law students to read at least that article. I think other articles, too. What's the idea of that article?
I looked at the timing of the spread of private family property rights among Indians of the American Northeast. And its timing was highly correlated with the coming of the fur trade to the New World. The Europeans came to get the furs. So the demand for furs went up high. Hunting went up high. Stocks of animals that were held in communal property rights arrangements got depleted fast.
And why would communal property deplete animals
Well,
too
because
quickly?
I don't own the animals that are on that force. So even though I know when I kill that animal, it's not going to be around to give birth to other animals, I don't care because I don't own the other animals either. So I take, just like you take fish out of the ocean. Whereas if I owned that land that the animals were on, I would conserve the animals, looking forward to the future of having more animals on there than are there right now. So private property rights does that.
You grew up in Chicago, I think. Isn't that right, Harold?
That's right. I grew up on the west side of Chicago, near what used to be the Sears Roebuck World Headquarters, about 4 miles west of the Loop, downtown. Spent the first 25 years of my life in that area.
And what kind of neighborhood was that when you were growing up?
It was a mix of immigrant families, mainly Italian and Jewish families. Many of the families had just come over. Well, my mother came over when she was about 7 years old, and my father was born in Baltimore of parents who had just come over. So we were almost contemporary immigrants.
And I think one of the children in your neighborhood was your future wife, wasn't it? Didn't she live right there in the same neighborhood?
Well, actually, she moved into my neighborhood when she was about 7 years old.
So you've known her practically your whole life, I guess.
That's
isn't it?
right. So the background was a common background, which I suppose has its disadvantages as well as advantages. But when she or I talk about the old days, we know what the other person means.
So I know you had some jobs in the neighborhood.
I got one of my first jobs was working in an ice cream factory in the neighborhood, making ice cream and popsicles. And in some of my writings, I talk about amenities on the job. The amenity part of my pay on the job was I could drink all the liquid ice cream that I wanted. Well, I took other jobs. I worked for Northwestern Railway in their mailroom. When I got a little older, in my teens with a driving license, I used to take out a checker cab over 3-day weekends, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, drive until I couldn't drive anymore, and made as much money as I could. And it was a good time. It was after World War II, and people were all coming in at the airport. There weren't enough taxis around, so it wasn't too hard to get fares. The taxi company had this dumb rule that you're only allowed to take one passenger or one fare at a time. But there was a shortage, so everybody's waiting in line, and they were all happy to share the taxi with somebody else. And that was my first lesson in efficiency. I said, to hell with the company. And we took more than one fare at a time.
You told me once that you're an opera lover. How did you acquire this love for opera? And you know quite a bit about it too.
You know, I don't actually know how I fell into this, but one of the jobs I took on was to usher at the Chicago Civic Opera House at night. That's when I was studying engineering at the University of Illinois in Chicago. So at nighttime, I would go work, and I saw lots of good operas. I got to love it. And some of the girls from the neighborhood, and later the woman who was going to be my wife, would do the same, except they would generally sell candy at the opera house. So we had a good thing going. I'll tell you, it was a good life. I can't afford to go to the opera now, but I had a good life then.
This was a neighborhood where many people in your parents' generation probably didn't go to the university. How did you decide how to go to the university and what university to go to?
I went walking distance, well, a long walk, maybe a mile and a half, to a junior college called Herzl Junior College. And I started off in engineering. I went there for a year. And then I learned that the University of Illinois is better than Herzl Junior College. So I transferred to the University of Illinois in Chicago and continued with my engineering. And then I got tired of school. I dropped out of school. and I decided to go out and earn money, and I went to work at a factory. After 4 months of work in the factory, I said, I better get back.
School was looking better at that point.
School looked pretty good then. But I said I was going to go as far from Chicago as I could. And I wanted to get away from engineering because I got tired of it when I was at Illinois. So I looked at the map. Where's the farthest place from Chicago? Seattle. So I'm going to go to Seattle. What's far away from engineering? Forestry. So I went to Seattle to study forestry. Just part of
I've
growing
never
up.
heard that story before.
Part of growing up. Well, the college found out I couldn't tell one tree from another tree. After I got lost a couple of times in the forest trying to count trees or whatever, measure trees, they advised me to go back to the Midwest.
Following the conversation at UCLA, Demsetz and his wife, Rita, welcomed us to their gracious home in the scenic hills of Tarzana, north of Los Angeles, where Harold gave credit to his closest collaborator.
Rita and I go for walks, 3-mile walks in the hills here. And on those walks, I frequently will broach an idea to her that I've got in my head that I'm putting in a paper or trying to put in the paper. And the kind of response I get from her is usually very insightful and of a sort that I wouldn't get from a professional colleague. She's helped improve a lot of my stuff and helped me throw away a lot of my stuff, too.
Well, I always like to try to find a flaw. I seldom find a flaw, but I give it a good shot. And the ideas are so often new to me, I think they're new to many people, and that's one of his great strengths.
Rita Demsetz notes the excitement and fun of discussing and arguing with Harold as he develops his novel ideas, and describes theirs as a joyous life, as she reflected on their journey together.
We both worked at the Civic Opera House. Harold worked as an usher, and I worked selling candy. That was a great way to spend your youth. And on occasion, since we lived so close together, Harold would give me a ride in his father's truck. But the truck had no seat behind the driver's seat, so I sat on a box behind the driver's seat. We didn't realize that in many ways we were disadvantaged. We considered ourselves advantaged, and in many ways we were. We like coming to California.
Well, I have to remind Rita that she's sort of forgetting the adversities of life, that I had just lost my shirt in the bond market, speculating on bonds. And the then chairman of the department here, Clay LaForce, made a very attractive offer for me to come out and just visit for a year. So I figure visit for a year to get my shirt back on, we could do. And then that started the whole thing going.
At the Demsetz Los Angeles home, Mark Grady further discussed the central themes and problems that drew the young Harold Demsetz into a life of exploration in economics.
This problem is one of the core problems of economics and was discovered first by a French economist who was looking at the Paris markets and how these Paris markets really coordinated human behavior, how every day different commodities would be brought in of various types, and at the end of the day, nothing was wasted. And to him, it seemed like a miracle. How does a market produce the information necessary to get all of these different players to coordinate their activities so that the citizens of Paris are supplied every day and there's very little waste?
People were acting independently. Farmers were acting independently. The customers were acting independently. So there must have been some set of incentives that brought them to do what they did. If the farmers thought business was going to be extra good on a day, they would bring in more than usual. And what does extra good mean? It means that they can make more profit if they brought more in on those days. On other days, if they thought that maybe because of the weather or something that the people buying would not be so plentiful, they'd bring less in, because if they brought more in, they would lose money on the extras that they brought in. They wouldn't be able to sell them. So there's an incentive that's built up on the part of the farmers that's really owes its source to their desire to make money, to make a profit. We have to just draw a distinction here. On the way the system worked in Paris and the way it works in this country, we have built up an explanation based on the desire to earn profits. The Russian experience, There were a lot of people who thought that the government could in fact do things better than independently acting people. Why? Because the government would be able to take into account the interactions between the various activities that were going on, whereas people acting independently, they thought would not be able to. Or they thought that there's money that's spent to compete. We could avoid that expenditure by not having competition, but by having planning, and that goes on. Okay. But they never produced a theory of bureaucracy, the equivalent of the economic theory of markets. So there was no theoretical support for those propositions. But they convinced a lot of people. During the 1940s and early 50s, a good part of the world was going in their direction. A dangerous part of the world was going in that direction. What convinced them to the otherwise is they couldn't deliver. People woke up to the fact that people were prospering when markets worked and were privately organized, and they were not prospering elsewhere in the world. So it was a factual demonstration of the inadequacy of bureaucracy to be able to know what's needed where and when, and to have the proper incentives, since the government official that's making the decisions is not making a profit based on those decisions. He does not have as great incentives to calculate carefully and to work hard at getting the right thing at the right place at the right time. And that's exactly what happens in the marketplace when individuals are trying to make a buck. When I say that the farmer is making a profit, okay, why is he making a profit? Because he owns the assets in which the fields in which the crops are grown, okay? He has property. And what making a profit means is doing the best he can with that property. If he didn't have the property, he wouldn't have the same incentives to do the job that he's doing as well as he's doing. So behind the price mechanism lies private ownership of resources.
So, Harold, when did you come up with this idea?
Well, 1967 is the paper that gets cited and by lawyers and lots of other people. And as is my habit, I said, I don't want to take the property rights system as a given. Where did the property rights system come from? Okay? And that's when the 1967 paper came about and was published, because my objective in that paper, well, the empirical work in that paper was to explain why property rights in land arose among American Indians in the Northeast, who, before they arose, had communal rights in the land, and why they didn't arise for the Southwestern Indians. And we talked about that yesterday, and it had to do with the profitability of bringing property rights into existence, because once you brought them into existence, there would be incentives to conserve on the hunting.
Now it's 40 years later, and these new property rights systems, and it seems to me, maybe because I'm your student, I see them everywhere. Fisheries, they've got new property rights systems that the government is creating to regulate the number of fish. These new congestion control systems in New York and London, air pollution systems here in Los Angeles and in other cities. All of this, I think, comes from your work, doesn't it?
I think you're right about that. Wait, I think you're right about that, and I don't deny it, okay? But for me, and that's satisfying, but for me, an intellectually satisfying aspect of it is nobody thought about trying to explain how property rights arise. That's an exercise in positive economics, not an exercise in normative regulatory policies or anything like that. And that's the thing I do pride myself in doing, of having thought about that problem. Not taking property rights as a given.
I think a good example of this, there are two examples, really very similar. In London and New York, they have these brand new systems to regulate congestion. And the government, in effect, sells off property rights to individuals to drive in London or New York during very congested times.
See, those people who attach a higher value to getting in close inside the city will be willing to buy those rights to do it from the city, okay? Those people who find it less valuable to do will satisfy themselves with taking public transportation into the city and not buy those tickets. So you get the space in the city auctioned off, essentially, to those people who are willing to pay the highest price to do it. And you do that by creating a property right to park in the city, which comes in the form of this license or this ticket that you buy. And it strikes people as seeming novel, but it's not really novel, because for a long time, perhaps under the pretext of reducing congestion, taxi cab drivers, of which I was one at one time, had to buy a medallion in New York or a license to be able to do it, and those were available in only limited numbers. So it held the congestion down, and it made the space available to those who are willing to pay for it. How did the San Fernando Valley get congested? The government built a freeway and didn't charge anybody to use it. It's that simple. It's that simple. Okay. Therefore, more people piled in to the San Fernando Valley than would have been the case if the government, even if it built the freeway, would charge a toll or sell a certificate that you put in your window that you have a right to drive on the freeway at a certain time, to price the scarcity of the freeway. The way the scarcity of the freeway is priced right now is first come, first serve. If I get on that freeway before somebody else, I occupy and have a property right to that moving space that's under my car for as long as I'm on that freeway.
That's what you call a communal property right in your work.
Well, to get on the freeway, it's a communal property right. That's right. Anybody can use the freeway wants to, and nobody has a right to exclude others from using the freeway. So it's the fact that a scarce resource was treated as if it were a free resource that creates the congestion to begin with, okay? Once you get the congestion, and it might come from other reasons also, not just from that reason, the problem is to get people how to conserve some scarce resource. It might be the quality of the air, which is difficult for people to own directly. And for reasons that we talked about yesterday, there aren't great incentives for one person to put a smog device on his car when everybody else benefits from the clean air and doesn't pay him to put that smog device on the car. So sometimes it's very difficult to resolve it directly, and you have to resolve it indirectly. How? By creating pseudo-property. Okay, a pseudo-property in the case of the Los Angeles Basin is they issue rights to put pollution in the air, put pollutants in the air, I should say. And the number of rights, which is the number of pounds of pollutants that could be put in the air, in total is what the state or some body of experts determine is the best to have. Satisfying various compromises here and there. They may make a mistake. I don't know. I don't testify to the quality of their decision on that. Once they make that decision, then these rights that they've issued can be bought and sold in the marketplace for putting pollutants in the air, so that some company that has a very tough time, has to incur a lot of cost to take the pollutants out of the air, will buy the certificates from a company, can cheaply take the pollutants out of the air, so you get the pollutants held to this total at as low a cost as possible by introducing a new form of property, these rights that are bought and sold.
I think they've been profoundly influenced by your work in that way.
Well, I'm pleased if I was able to do something to help a little bit. I'd like to be on the conservative side here. There are going to be some problems that are not so easily solved even in this way. This business about what's the world going to be like 300 years from now? Okay. How to auction off the use of the world in those 300 years, that's essentially what's involved, or those 500 years. Many of those problems can be solved in this way by proper use of interest rates in the markets and things like that. But it's difficult for any person, single person, to control the quality of the air 500 years out. So it may be that it's not easy to solve that kind of problem in that way, but it also may be that we haven't thought hard enough about it, and maybe we can.
At the end of the day, I think ideas do matter, and certainly the ideas that Harold has generated over the years have affected public policy.
There was an intellectual ferment that his work stirred up. What's the result? Public policy today is much more guarded about attacking mergers. Right? There's a connection.
I think his work is pervasive and is going to survive in this way, that it's just the way people look at problems is fundamentally changed.
He's a seminal thinker. I hope the Nobel Committee recognizes that.
Harold certainly deserves it.
I deliberately chose to go into a field that Harold works in after reading his work.
He's a mensch, you know. He really is a wonderful person.
Demsetz is currently at work on a new book of essays concerning the nature of human behavior and its impact on economic theory. He accepted another invitation to speak in China, yet still finds time for the more important things too, like his grandchildren. One of the most renowned economists of our time, and among the premier innovators in the field of law and economics, Harold Demsetz has made a crucial impression on human society and the way it understands itself. As part of Liberty Fund's Intellectual Portrait Series, this has been A Conversation with Harold Demsetz.